Hey everybody, Lori Spencer here. Welcome to this week's History Book Club series, where for the past several weeks we've been reading from Jerry Oppenheimer's book on RFK Jr. This one is called Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream, published by St. Martin's Press 10 years ago now, in 2015. This will be episode 4 of the series, The Dark Side of RFK Jr. Since the chapters are short, we've been blazing through this book pretty quickly, and we're now up to chapter 8. We'll see if I can get through 3 or 4 more chapters in this episode. I'm just going to read until I get tired. And if you're enjoying this History Book Club series about RFK Jr., please do share the full playlist of all the episodes, and I've got that linked for you down in the comments below. Also, be sure to take a moment to like this video, sub to my channel, and click the notifications bell so you'll always be the first to know when a new episode drops. Donald Trump will be sworn in Monday as the 47th President of the United States, and confirmation hearings are already underway for several of his cabinet appointees. As of right now, we don't yet have an exact date for RFK Jr.'s Senate confirmation hearings to start, but expect that to be announced very soon. Of course, we will be following that process as it moves along very closely, and we'll keep you advised. So in the meantime, let's continue this fascinating book by Jerry Oppenheimer, who also penned a spicy biography of the late Ethel Kennedy, RFK Jr.'s mother. That book is entitled The Other Mrs. Kennedy. I highly recommend it. This Oppenheimer book on RFK Jr. is pretty lengthy. I'm not reading the entire book, just some selected excerpts for you, but I highly encourage you to buy a copy and read this entire book. It is juicy. If you do have a hard copy, feel free to follow along with this book club reading. And this week we will start on page 73 if you have the first edition hardcover, chapter 8. Milbrook Triumvirate. In his second year at Milbrook, Bobby began boasting that he was doing certain drugs intravenously, shooting up, like any street junkie. One of those, he told, was his roommate, Jamie Fanning. "I can't say that I saw him put a needle in his arm," he stated, but he talked like he was, and he bragged about it. He'd say, "When you're shooting speed, it's such a good rush." It was that kind of talk, more bragging. But I believed him. I'd known him then for a few months and knew he used to do anything. It was pretty clear he had some intravenous drug use back then, and he was the only person we knew who did. Cocaine rumors flew, too. There was campus talk that Bobby had reported to the nurse's office with a bloody nose, which sparked whispers that he suffered some sort of drug-related nose injury. From what I heard, Bobby had been taking a fair amount of cocaine and had a deviated septum. That's the area separating the nostrils, sometimes caused by snorting cocaine, or something like that. It was the first time I'd ever heard the term deviated septum used, and it related to Bobby and cocaine, recalled Bruce Whitcomb, a talented music student whose father headed the European advertising department for Time Life, and whose stepfather, a TV executive, gave local stations the green light to air I Love Lucy. By the time the talk of cocaine and intravenous substances was in the air, there was campus chatter that Bobby Kennedy had become part of a Milbrook school triumvirate, suspected by some classmates of leaving campus and sneaking into New York City to score methamphetamine and even heroin. But, recalled a classmate, Bobby was fairly close-mouthed about what he was doing there. Bobby's confederates were Michael Parkinson, a promising artist from a well-to-do, politically connected Manhattan family, and a Philadelphia boy, Michael Amory Rivenus, I think it's Rivenus, who sported the longest hair in Bobby's class and whose father was a corporate drug executive. Parkinson, described as pretty crazy, artistic, hippie, and rich by Jamie Fanning, was one of Bobby's close bonds formed in what would be the first of his troubled, barely 2 academic years at Milbrook, during which he was required, as it was said, to repeat his sophomore year because of poor grades and unacceptable behavior. Like Bobby, Parkinson was skinny, glib, and frenetic, Both were increasingly reckless, had hyperactive and addictive personalities, and their friendship would endure into their dark adult years, a curious alliance that was tragically bound by drugs. Moreover, Parkinson had the beginnings of a debilitating mental illness that was still undiscovered or well hidden when he was at Milbrook. Bobby and Michael became very close, says Peter Parkinson, the youngest of the Parkinson siblings, who idolized his older brother. They were both interested in animals. Bobby had his falcon, and Michael had woolly monkeys at home and at school. Bobby and my brother had a lot of camaraderie. Their bond was their pets, their intelligence, and their charisma. And Michael was a very, very talented artist, and Bobby liked art. During their time at Milbrook, Parkinson, who did striking caricatures of faculty and students, had also done a portrait of Bobby. But Bobby and Parkinson also shared an interest in drugs, which Peter Parkinson noted was not the highlight of their friendship. Parkinson, his brother said, became a close family friend to the Kennedys and got to know Bobby's Uncle Teddy and his Aunt Jackie. Bobby's mother, Ethel, adored him. Because of Michael's close Kennedy ties, his brother, Peter, was enlisted by Ethel to work at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport to help with some of the youngest of her 11 children. Parkinson was one of many young people who had usually worked for free and often were treated rudely and shabbily by Bobby's mom. Over the years, many such helpers had witnessed her bad behavior. Noelle Fell, one of a long string of secretaries who had gotten fed up and left because of Mrs. Kennedy's mistreatment, recalled how the mistress of Hickory Hill once slapped a foreign maid because she misunderstood an order. The woman ran out of the room crying, and when Fell attempted to calm her down, she said, "I'm never going to work here again. No one has ever slapped me." According to Bobby's classmate and friend, Scott Riviere, the incident was typical of Ethel's bizarre behavior. He was among the very few at Milbrook whom Bobby had invited home to Hickory Hill, known to those harshly treated by the RFK matriarch as Horror Hill. Riviere had platinum Washington political and society credentials. His mother, Marilyn Himes Riviere, had become a close friend of Jacqueline Lee Bouvier when she first arrived in Washington. While Bobby hadn't known Riviere before they met at Milbrook, his mother, a noted equestrian and one of America's first female helicopter pilots, and his stockbroker father had socialized at Washington parties with RFK and Ethel. When they saw them at parties, Riviere recalled, "My father said they drove him crazy, particularly RFK, because he said all he did was sit and talk about himself, and my father thought they were complete bores." The Kennedy family scenes Riviere said he witnessed during his visits with Bobby to Hickory Hill when they were both at Milbrook were still deeply disturbing to him many years later. Bobby then was very mixed up, Riviere observed. He'd been through a lot with his father's death, and his mother wasn't easy. She was pretty tough, so he was in a really tough spot. Bobby never seemed to completely relax. It was as if he had attention deficit disorder. He had this nervous energy. He was just a very lost, damaged person at a time when we were all figuring out who we were and what we were about. There were times at Hickory Hill when Riviere couldn't believe what was going on. As he later asserted, Ethel Kennedy was not the image America had of her. He had been helping Bobby build a hawk house in the Hickory Hill stables, he recalled. There were some really bad Ethel scenes. Bobby had that hyperactivity, and Ethel had that too, he said, and she couldn't control him, and that drove her crazy. She would make these threats that she was going to take all his birds away from him and close down his project. Bobby was really angry at her, and my role was to try and keep things as balanced as possible. One mother-son battle occurred just before a reporter and photographer from a major magazine, it might have been Life, were coming in to do a feature on the late RFK's family's post-assassination life at Hickory Hill. There was no way Bobby was going to sit still for it, Riviere said. And she was making all kinds of threats, and she was yelling at all of her kids and saying she didn't want any of them around her. But then the people from the magazine arrived, and all of a sudden it was all sweetness and light. Some of the saddest scenes Riviere said he witnessed at Hickory Hill involved several of Bobby's youngest siblings, Courtney, Max, and Rory, the girl born after RFK's assassination. Rory was just a baby, and Ethel had a volunteer taking care of her, and little Courtney and Max were like two lost children, he said. They would just follow me around all the time because they wanted attention from anyone, and they were just so sweet. It just killed me to go over there. I wanted to do something for them. These kids were like a lot of abandoned souls wandering around, and all these kids were so damaged. I saw the dysfunction at Hickory Hill, and whenever I was there, I just felt an overwhelming sense of sadness because there was just no one there with the kids. It was not like anything what the outside world thought. It was like everybody on the inside knew what was going on, but it wasn't public. When I was there, I saw Bobby's family environment and how disconnected everything was, just completely disconnected. There was dog poop all over the house, and the volunteers were running around frantically, and everybody jumped when Ethel said jump, and everybody was nervous and afraid, including the kids. And then if somebody walked in whom Ethel thought was important, she'd put on a big show. Ethel had volunteers doing everything, and she didn't want to have anything to do with any of her kids. It was hard watching that. My time spent at Hickory Hill, all that did was give me insight and more compassion for Bobby. One school of thought was that it had all been different when RFK was alive and had control of the home situation, but Riviere was aware from his friend Bobby and others connected to the iconic Hickory Hill family that RFK was never home, or rarely. His life revolved around his career as Attorney General, as a senator, as a presidential candidate, and as a womanizer. As Riviere noted, Ethel was still on her own when RFK was alive. They never saw him. In October 2012, HBO aired an hour-long documentary called Ethel, which was filmed and directed by RFK and Ethel's last-born, Rory Elizabeth Catherine Kennedy, married and the mother of 3. It painted a loving portrait of Mummy, as some of her surviving children, among them Bobby, called their mother. Filmed in 2011 at the compound in Hyannisport when Ethel Skakel Kennedy was 84, it featured Bobby speaking lovingly of the happy marriage his parents had, and viewers were shown cute home movies that focused on Mrs. Kennedy's fun side. But none of the unpleasant reality, as witnessed by Scott Riviere and many others who had spent time at Hickory Hill, was depicted. The TV critic for the New York Times, Alessandra Stanley, who reviewed the film under the headline "Cheerfulness Amid Calamity," seemed to have a sense of what really went on at Hickory Hill. She described Ethel as maddeningly incomplete. Watching it, she observed, is a little like reading a classified report redacted by Dick Cheney. So much material is blacked out that it's almost impossible to follow. The film, for instance, showed Mrs. Kennedy at RFK's side at political events, her husband's indefatigable helpmate, often with several children in tow. There is, noted Stanley, obviously a talent for compartmentalizing in this family, which may explain how the children of Robert Kennedy can talk blithely of periods that are imprinted in the public memory as times of calamity and also disgrace. When Scott Riviere heard about the film, he made certain to watch it because he said, "I was curious about Ethel. His view? It was well staged," he said. "Here we all are, just one big happy family." After the assassination, Ethel was under pressure from the Kennedy family, particularly her brother-in-law, Steve Smith, the Klan's icy Machiavellian controller of the exchequer, to cut back on her wild spending and downgrade her lifestyle. So she began shopping for clothing, wearing the articles, and then returning them. On one of his visits to Hickory Hill, Riviere heard angry complaints from the unpaid volunteers who were forced to participate in Mrs. Kennedy's shop return scheme, and he once was drafted himself to participate. He said she would send people who worked for her to McLean to pick up a dress for her, for trial, to buy, and then she'd wear it to a party, and then she'd return it. The shop owners would just get crazy and didn't want to have anything to do with her. I was the new person, the kid, and one of her volunteers hands me a dress and tells me to take it in and return it to the dress shop because none of the others were going to go through that humiliation again. And then, of course, I got humiliated. The first time I was at Hickory Hill, her help couldn't wait to hand me a dress and tell me where to return it. She treated the volunteers terribly. If you came to Hickory Hill, it didn't matter if you were Andy Williams, to whom Ethel had been romantically linked back then, or if you were me, just a teenager. When you walked into the house, she put you to work. The shops in McLean, Virginia, where Hickory Hill was located, weren't the only targets of Ethel Skakel Kennedy's shopping scheme. She also pulled, or tried to pull, her scam, all well documented, in such upscale Washington, D.C. stores as Bloomingdale's and Saks Fifth Avenue. One of the most blatant incidents occurred at a fancy dress shop called Saks West End in the Tony, D.C. suburb of Chevy Chase, Maryland. Ethel had picked out a $750 Oleg Cassini number and opened a house account instead of paying cash up front. A week later, the saleswoman, Jane Abraham, spotted Ethel in a newspaper photograph wearing the dress. Not long after, one of Ethel's embarrassed helpers arrived at the shop with the dress, asking to return it and seeking credit for her mistress. It was on a hanger in a plastic bag with a dry cleaner's tag attached. Abraham refused to take it back and sent a note to Hickory Hill that read, "Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I'm terribly sorry, but the dress has been altered. The dress has been cleaned, and we are not a second-hand store. If you don't care for the dress after wearing it, why don't you try selling it to the second-hand stores?" To the note and the dress, Abraham had attached the hard evidence, the newspaper photo of Ethel actually wearing the dress. She never heard again from Mrs. Kennedy. Bobby happened to be home from Milbrook on a break when his mother decided to pack up everyone and head to the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. As the station wagon was being loaded and the younger Kennedy kids were about to be transported to the airport for a private plane flight to the Cape, Bobby's prized hawk took off and landed in a treetop on a neighboring property. Needing help to retrieve the bird, Bobby telephoned Riviere, who was staying with his mother at the chic Georgetown Inn across the Potomac in Washington. Driven to Hickory Hill by his mother's chauffeur in her Rolls-Royce, Riviere was met with what he recalled was a typical chaotic scene. Ethel had people running around and getting her ready for the trip, and Bobby was upset. He said, "You have to help me get the Falcon. I don't know what to do." But Ethel started throwing stuff at me to put in the car, and she had everyone working, and she wouldn't let Bobby get his bird down. When they left, I put on climbing spurs and climbed up to the top of the tree and got the bird. Ethel's secretary at the time, she reportedly went through a number of secretaries, was in tears that day, Riviere recalled. He said he had to follow Ethel and the others to the airport and said, "The secretary was crying and she almost went off the road, and I'm thinking, God, we're going to be in a wreck." Then Ethel realizes that this person is going to be house-sitting alone for her and be doing everything for free, and the woman is heaving and hyperventilating. And Ethel put her arms around her and said, "You know, I couldn't do without you." And then she walked up the steps and onto the plane, and now the woman is beaming because Ethel Kennedy had patted her on the head. I always had the feeling that people could put a lot of work into something for her, and then she would roar in 5 minutes later and just take everything apart. I'd never heard such blue language from Ethel as I did during that incident when they were going to Hyannisport. It was that thing she had, that sense of entitlement. Besides her use of profanity at times, Ethel Skakel Kennedy also possessed a streak of brutality. Bobby had been the brunt of it when she punished him with a hairbrush, and his cousin, Christopher Kennedy Lawford, also had been a victim of her abuse. Lawford didn't much care for the Big E, as she was called behind her back, and thought of her as volatile and a very big presence in the clan, way bigger than her 5 feet and 4 inches. He might have felt negatively towards her because of her treatment of him when he was just a kid, often kicking him out at the Hyannisport house for not standing up when she came into a room, behavior that he noted didn't happen when his uncle RFK was alive, but became endemic after he died. The punishment for egregious crimes could be worse, he said. That was underscored for Lawford after he once told a childish, naughty joke, and she came towards him, quote, tackling me and pummeling me. The most severe incident, however, was when she caught him having a physical altercation with her son, David. As Lawford told it, she grabbed my hand with such force that she broke my thumb with a snap. Chapter 9. Friends Die. Michael Rivenus, the other member of Bobby's druggy Milbrook triumvirate, along with Michael Parkinson, was described as an edgy kid who fought against school rules, such as the long line he was forced to stand in at breakfast while attendance was checked. His protest was to not eat, but rather to stand there and drink a can of Coca-Cola. Rivenus actually grew his own marijuana near his home in Philadelphia's exclusive Chestnut Hill section, oddly enough with the consent of his father, Francis Marco Rivenus, who ran one of the world's largest drug companies at the time, Smith, Kline, and French Laboratories, later GlaxoSmithKline Corporation. The senior Rivenus gave classes on conservation and was something of an eccentric who, wearing old clothes, was often spotted cleaning graffiti off buildings and litter from the streets. My father felt that he would rather Michael grow marijuana than buy it, so he used to grow it between the rows of my father's corn patch in Chestnut Hill, says Mark Rivenus, one of the 6 siblings of Michael, who was the youngest. It was almost like he smoked pot because he grew pot. It's almost like he had to harvest his crop. Michael was one of those kinds of people who, if he took something on, like smoking marijuana, then he had to grow his own. So he was a farmer who smoked pot. Along with Bobby and Parkinson, Rivenus had arrived at Milbrook in the fall of 1968 as a sophomore, and his brother believes that it's certainly possible that Rivenus smuggled his harvested pot into the school where he divvied it up with Bobby, Parkinson, and the other tokers. High most of the time, Rivenus hated Milbrook and stayed for just a year before returning home. But during that time, he and Parkinson were among the very few in Bobby's small magic circle who were invited to the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, where they would party and get stoned. Michael became such a close friend of Robert's that he'd go to the Kennedy compound, where he had a wonderful time and kind of regaled us with stories of the Kennedy elders, recounted Mark Rivenus decades later. Most of the senior members of the Kennedy family were there one Thanksgiving or Christmas, and for Michael to be in contact with those people and welcomed into the clan was just kind of fun, being around this family that had such an incredible impact on American life. Here he was, just a young kid who happened to go to a school where one of their offspring happened to be, and all of a sudden he was mixing with them and shaking hands with Teddy Kennedy. Michael would return home to Chestnut Hill, happily boasting to everyone about his close Kennedy ties, telling neighbors of the Rivenus family, "Oh, you have the exact same dishwasher the Kennedys have." They were duly impressed. In reality, young Rivenus did not enjoy such a warm and cozy relationship with America's royal family. It's clear that there were drugs related to Michael's relationship with Robert Jr. At one point, Bobby and my brother actually got thrown off the compound for smoking marijuana, reveals Mark Rivenus. We don't know who threw them out, but it was probably Bobby's mother, which makes sense. But Rivenus denied that his brother did harder drugs with Bobby at Milbrook. He said Michael may have liked and been part of Bobby's pot-smoking group, but he definitely wasn't into anything heavier than that. Thinking of Michael and drugs is not like thinking of Robert Kennedy Jr. and heavy drugs. It was just not the same relationship. After 1 year at Milbrook, Rivenus returned to Philadelphia and attended private school and was later accepted to Harvard. But before starting college, he had planned a trip to Paris to study French. Michael felt it was absolutely critical that he be a cultured person and that French was the lingo of the educated class, says his brother. The summer before classes began in Cambridge, Rivenus, just short of his 19th birthday, was on his Honda motorcycle en route to a piano lesson, possibly stoned, and when he slammed into the rear of a Cadillac that his brother says had cut in front of him. He went over the top of the car, broke his neck, and died. Michael Rivenus would be one of the first, but not the last, of Bobby's druggy friends and relatives who had harrowing, untimely deaths. The other member of Bobby's ill-fated triumvirate, Michael Parkinson, also eventually had a violent end because of drugs and emotional issues. But as an artist, he had gained some fame, helped by the Kennedys. Like Michael Rivenus, Michael Parkinson also left Milbrook, in his case due to a behavior problem and drug use. He finally graduated from a New York City public high school, but his drug experimentation continued along with Bobby's. In mid-July 1972, for example, there was a brief Associated Press report from Columbia, South America, that Bobby had paid a $13 fine for Parkinson, quote, who got in touch for playing rock music on a cathedral pipe organ, according to the news service, quoting the local police. The boy, Parkinson, then 17, had the alternative of a 30-day arrest or the fine. The AP story, with a New York dateline, went on to report that Parkinson and Bobby, then 18 years old, had arrived in Colombia 2 weeks earlier on what was described as a South American tour. Witnesses reported Parkinson went into the local cathedral during Mass and without authorization started to play rock and roll music on the pipe organ. According to the short news account, seemingly based on sketchy information, young Kennedy was not with him, Parkinson, at the time. But there was more to the incident than was thoroughly reported in some newspapers, according to Parkinson's brother, Peter. He said they were both, Bobby and Michael, on a drug trip when that happened in Colombia. And Michael almost died from the drugs, he revealed in 2013. At the time, Peter was working in Mississippi for Shell Oil, where the Parkinson brothers' father was an executive. When the psychedelic drug overdose happened, Peter was summoned to return home to New York to help deal with his brother's dire situation. It was believed that Bobby and Parkinson had traveled to Colombia with Lem Billings as their escort. We brought Michael back, and he was sick for almost a month and almost died, Peter Parkinson said. My parents were upset, as one can imagine. He said it was his understanding that the drug they had taken was some sort of psychedelic magic mushroom, and that his brother, quote, may have gone into the cathedral for some solace from a bad trip. After Parkinson got well, he told a family friend that he and Bobby were tripping on acid in the church. In Bobby's The River Keepers, there was no mention of getting stoned and nearly arrested with his friend in Colombia, where the illegal drug trade, heroin and cocaine, was a way of life. Instead, he painted a nice picture of his many visits to the country, working manual labor one summer at a ranch managed by Lem Billings' nephew, or acting as a guide for his brother Michael's whitewater rafting business, or just sailing the Meadow River in a canoe. 3 years after the near-fatal Colombian psychedelic overdose episode, Michael Parkinson graduated in 1975 from Pratt Institute in Brooklyn with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in painting, and in 1977 with a Master of Fine Arts in sculpture. As a friend, Andrew Humes observed, Michael was a brilliant artist. One of the friend's prized pieces of art was Parkinson's Milbrook School portrait of Bobby Kennedy Jr. Bobby was kind enough, along with our father, to steer Michael in the right direction and have him take commissions for artwork. And so he would do painting and so forth, and then he went into making little ceramic houses, said Peter Parkinson. He was really talented with that. In April 1980, Parkinson was featured in People magazine under a headline that teased, "Master builder Michael Parkinson's houses aren't homes, but it takes a Kennedy to afford them." While there was no mention of the Colombian psychedelic trip with Bobby or Parkinson's history of addiction and increasingly erratic behavior, facts that the Celebrity Weekly probably was unaware of, the article instead presented him, at 26, as a glib, urbane artiste who was designing miniature ceramic homes for the rich and famous. And he was quoted as making a curiously bizarre comment about the taste of at least one of his close Kennedy clients, Bobby's Aunt Jean Kennedy Smith. He told the magazine that she had stuck a mirror over a mantel, marring the ceramic model of her mansion that he had obsessively spent hours constructing. A typical case of Kennedy tackiness, he was quoted as muttering. The article noted that the Kennedys are used to his biting comments and pointed out Ethel Kennedy has known Michael since he was a schoolboy, palling around with young David and Bobby Jr. It was Bobby who commissioned Parkinson to do 2 of his earliest works, and other members of the family were soon weighing in with their orders. Besides the Kennedys, Parkinson's other clients for his miniature houses, each sold for as much as $4,000, included Hugh Hefner, who commissioned a model of the Playboy Mansion in Chicago, William F. Buckley, also a Milbrook alumnus, Lem Billings, his Manhattan townhouse, which Bobby would actually later inherit after Billings's death, and a number of other celebrities. As Andrew Humes, who had one of Parkinson's miniature English taverns, noted, Michael loved society people. If you had some connection with somebody, he would wriggle himself into various social situations. He liked hanging out with important people. He was good at that. And he was an amazingly charming man. He loved flirting, and he was the funniest guy. He also loved to party, and he and Bobby regularly showed up together in the late 1970s and early 1980s at trendy Manhattan discos, Xenon, Studio 54, where cocaine, pot, and heroin were an integral part of the frenzied scene. Besides making art, Parkinson was musical and played the bagpipes, often to the annoyance of others. But for the annual New York City Columbus Day Parade, he and Bobby marched and played their bagpipes together, Peter Parkinson remembered. Because of his emotional instability, Parkinson spent money wildly. Some $60,000, part of his inheritance from his father, was used to buy a commercial on a New York City TV station. The theme was, "Give Peace a Chance," according to Humes. That was a nutty thing for Michael to do because he didn't have a lot of money. He once purchased an expensive, beautiful 1927 yacht, the 85-foot Rantera, as an investment, sold it for half of what he paid, repurchased it for more than he had sold it for, and then sold it again for less. He bought and sold the boat 3 times, and with the 4th owner, the boat finally sank, his brother said. By the early 90s, his emotional problems and drug addiction had gotten worse. Attempts by Bobby, the other Kennedys, and the Parkinson family to help him were to no avail. He decided that he didn't want to get help, said his brother. According to Humes, Parkinson was a bit of a crazy guy. I don't know if you'd call it exactly schizophrenia. He was on and off meds for a good part of the later period of his life. For most of the last 4 or 5 years of his life, he was supposed to be on something, and when he wasn't, he tended to go off the handle. In those last years, Parkinson was living in what was described as a crummy little apartment at 177 East 3rd Street on Manhattan's Lower East Side, just a couple of blocks from the clubhouse of the Hells Angels at 77 East 3rd Street. It was a rather rough neighborhood, Peter Parkinson recalled. I used to go down there, and frankly, I didn't want to get out of the car. According to his brother, Parkinson had gotten in with a sort of street crowd. Michael was having tirades, and Michael had some altercations with members of the legendary motorcycle organization. He'd go down to the Hells Angels and yell, "Fuck you," that type of thing, and I just knew that they were rough. Michael was found dead in the bathtub of his apartment in 1994. People who knew him speculated that because of his emotional problems, he had committed suicide. Humes recalled that Parkinson was doing drugs pretty heavily at the time. But Parkinson's brother denied that suicide was the cause. He said, "I think he was drugged and probably murdered. That's my guess." But there never was a police investigation. There was also no obituary because, as Humes observed, the circumstances of his death were embarrassing, and so his family didn't want to draw any attention to it at all. It was very sad. In New York, there was a church memorial service for Parkinson. His close friend, Bobby Kennedy Jr., didn't attend, but he sent his wife, Mary Richardson Kennedy, who was also a friend of Parkinson's. "My brother was a great artist and a very talented guy," Peter Parkinson said, looking back years later. "And if it hadn't been for drugs in his life, just like if it hadn't been for drugs in Bobby's life, Bobby might be doing something different today, and my brother might still be alive." Chapter 10. Chappaquiddick Summer. Bobby was on his summer break before starting his second year at Milbrook when, on July 18th, 1969, two teenagers walking across a narrow wooden bridge near Edgartown on Chappaquiddick Island saw the outline of a submerged car. Edgartown's police chief, Dominic Arena, arrived at the scene, dove in, and spotted a 1967 black Oldsmobile in the murky water. A diver from the fire department went down and surfaced with the license plate number L78207. Arena ran the plate. The owner's name and address was a shocker. Edward M. Kennedy, room 2400 JFK Building, Government Center, Boston, Massachusetts. His immediate thought was that Teddy Kennedy had drowned. Yet another tragedy on the heels of his brother RFK's murder 13 months earlier. But inside the sunken sedan was the body of a lone young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne, a pretty, petite blonde whose 29th birthday was just a week away. Her body was in a state of rigor mortis, and it was clear from her position that she had made a desperate attempt to escape before she drowned. Arena's instant reaction? "Thank God it isn't one of the Klan." Mary Jo Kopechne had been close to RFK and Ethel for some 5 years. In 1964, she had been hired as a secretary in Bobby's father's Senate office. She'd spent time at Hickory Hill and particularly liked young Bobby. At the Virginia homestead, she had typed RFK's anti-Vietnam War speech, had even helped phrase his presidential announcement, and during the campaign, she was one of the Boiler Room Girls, a small group of trusted staffers who compiled voter data. And now she was dead, after attending a reunion-like party in Edgartown of the Boiler Room Girls and other RFK campaign workers. Less known was that she was there at the invitation of Bobby's Uncle Ted, married, father of 3, a presidential contender in the hearts and minds of many who had invited her to the 46th Annual Edgartown Yacht Club Regatta. The day the scandal broke, Bobby's mother, Ethel, had made an appearance at the opening of the first Connecticut Special Olympics, the family's favorite charity. Back at the compound, where the Klan and top advisors had gathered to deal with the scandal, Ethel couldn't process any of it, a family friend recalled. Here was a woman who was still in a state of shock over the death of her husband, who had lost control of her children, and now the man who she was relying on to keep her on steady ground, the only shoulder she had to lean on, seemed to be self-destructing before her eyes. Meanwhile, the widow, always the most loyal of the Kennedy women next to Rose, was called into action, telephoning high-powered Washington friends to get involved in what many soon came to believe was a cover-up, involving Senator Kennedy's questionable actions in the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. Ethel was also ordered to call the Kopechnes to tell them that she and her brother-in-law would be at Mary Jo's funeral. She talked about faith, how it could help, the dead girl's father later recalled. At the funeral, a woman carried a red, white, and blue sign, Kennedy for President, 1972. 3 days later, the last Kennedy brother of his generation pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident, received a 2-month suspended sentence, and was placed on a year's probation. It was a virtual slap on the wrist. If his name wasn't Kennedy, he would have faced more serious charges, many in the media and the public believed. That night, he went on national television, called his conduct indefensible, and asked Massachusetts voters to decide whether he should resign. He would be re-elected in November 1970, but the scandal would rage on, impacting any higher political aspirations, especially his later hopes of running for the presidency. Many thought Kennedy was lying. He'd been caught lying before, but that situation was quite different. As an undergrad at Harvard, from where his brothers JFK, RFK, and Joe Jr. had graduated, Ted was caught cheating on an exam. Fearing that a poor grade in Spanish would impact his goal to make the university's varsity football team, as his brothers RFK and JFK had, he asked a dorm mate, Bill Freight, to take the final exam for him. They were caught, and each received a 1-year suspension. Years later, in his 2009 memoir, Kennedy devoted a chapter to the scandal. It was aptly titled, "The Harvard Screw-Up." Chappaquiddick was devastating for Bobby's mother, too. While publicly she was vocally supportive of her brother-in-law, now the family patriarch, privately she felt abandoned by him, revealed George Terrian, her brother-in-law on the Skakel side. She had a lot of anger, he said, anger towards Ted, anger towards Bobby for dying, and anger towards her sons. In Bobby's case, his family role model had failed him miserably. When he returned to Milbrook for his second turbulent year, a classmate recalled him muttering, "My uncle is a major asshole getting caught like he did." In addition to the Trevor Zoo, where young Bobby spent most of his free time, Milbrook also had an actual observatory. So we conjured up an astronomical oddity, said one of his classmates. Bobby was singled out just by virtue of who he was, but not always, such as when he got in trouble for desecrating the sanctity of the white-steepled Milbrook Chapel by inviting girls there, supposedly for sexual purposes. Early on, in the tradition of his Kennedy male elders, Bobby, who was then only a sophomore at Milbrook, was already earning a reputation as a Casanova of sorts. While Milbrook was an all-boys school back then, girls were sneaking on campus to meet the cute Kennedy scion as if he were a rock star, and there were girls bussed in from fancy finishing schools for school dances who were drawn to him because of his famous name and seeming celebrity status. And Bobby, a full-fledged Kennedy, took advantage of the situation. As his classmate Brian Carroll observed years later, Bobby preyed on visiting girls like a hawk on mice. His roommate, Jamie Fanning, said, "I didn't think of Bobby as physically attractive, but he had that bad boy twinkle in his eye that a lot of girls like. He talked about girls in twisted, sick ways, discussing oral sex, him on them, that none of us had ever tried or even conceived of at the time." Christopher West, Brian Carroll's roommate, asserted that when Milbrook had dances, quote, Bobby had women hanging all over him. The girls literally jumped all over him. And he used to take the girls over to the chapel, and it was very quiet over there, let's put it that way. Along with being a quiet place to have a liaison with a liberated 60s co-ed on the night of a weekend dance, the chapel had an added perk. Well hidden inside one of the organ pipes was a stash of primo marijuana. During his secret explorations of the chapel, presumably for various nefarious purposes, Bobby had discovered a set of stairs behind the altar that offered access to a very private attic-like space above the vaulted ceiling, a perfect place to bring a girl, or to smoke, or to do both. He had once brought his roommate, Fanning, up there, and while walking around, Bobby had put his foot through the chapel's ceiling plaster. The damage was visible for months from the pews below. At church on Sunday, I can remember looking up and thinking, there's that freaking hole. Bobby was a little klutzy, always leaping before he looked, always charging into trouble. But the chapel was a good hiding spot to take girls. By the middle of Bobby's second year at Milbrook, around January 1970, he was placed on a secret short list of students considered too difficult to remain enrolled. His behavior, particularly his drug use, had the administration concerned that if something happened to the young Kennedy, such as an overdose or worse, all hell would come down on the school and tarnish its reputation. Peter Cole, who taught English and had gotten to know Bobby, said it was generalized knowledge among the faculty that a number of the students were using drugs, and that Bobby had later been identified as one of them. We as faculty members all seemed to have this awareness of Bobby's behavior and were totally unable to do anything about it, Cole asserted years later. We did catch him, finally, and he was going to get tossed, but I felt sorry for the kid who I knew back then. I tended not to blame him, as maybe I should have, for his drug misdeeds. I just think he had a need for close companionship, and maybe the people supplying the drugs, or buying the drugs, provided it. While Wright was preparing to begin his regime at Milbrook, Neil Howard contacted him, expressing his concerns about Bobby's behavior and the drugs. Quote, Neil asked me what my opinion was about retaining Bobby Kennedy, and I said, in my opinion, I think you ought to let him go, recalled Wright years later. Neil told me that he was considering expelling Bobby because he'd been using and providing drugs. I don't recall what kind of drugs it was, but Neil had quite a list of problems involving Bobby and felt that Bobby had a reputation for breaking the rules. It seemed to be the feeling that Bobby, as a Kennedy, felt he was above the law, that he was arrogant, and that he could do what he wanted and get away with it. With Wright's support, Howard decided to quietly expel Bobby and contacted Bobby's surrogate father, Lem Billings, to inform him of the decision. Wright also had a meeting with Billings face-to-face. Bobby's departure was already a fait accompli when I met Billings, and he didn't try to change anybody's minds. He accepted it. Wright said he never heard from Bobby's mother after the decision was made to boot her son. Peter Cole recalled that before the decision was finally made, Milbrook's administration was, quote, bending over backwards to protect Bobby and keep him in. I don't think they felt any joy in showing him the door. We didn't dwell on it after he left, and the administration quite rightly didn't publicize it. The decision to expel Bobby from Milbrook, the school from which he later indicated in his book The River Keepers he had graduated, was kept very hush-hush, recalled the music teacher, James Hedgick. There was never any kind of disciplinary hearing or anything like that. He was just here and gone. There was no gnashing of teeth and sobbing in the context of his leaving. It didn't come as a big surprise. Among the faculty, there may have been a collective sigh of relief, given the culture of those times, because things with Bobby would only have escalated, and the attitude was, okay, he's now the next school's problem. One would have thought Bobby's embarrassing expulsion would have spelled the end of his relationship with Milbrook School, but curiously, he was invited back as the honored commencement speaker for the class of 1998, and he was even billed as a Milbrook alumnus class of 72. It was not pointed out that he had never actually graduated. While on campus for his much ballyhooed commencement speech, he visited with his goddaughter, Zoe Haydock, who was in the class of 2000. In 2010, Milbrook School avidly promoted a speaking engagement Bobby had at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, a not-for-profit environmental organization in Milbrook. The school's pitch for getting people to come hear him praised the once-banished druggie as a resolute defender of the environment and noted that Time magazine had named him one of the heroes for the planet. Milbrook teachers and students who knew Bobby back in the day when he was getting stoned and chasing rats with his falcon among a pile of cow carcasses got a chuckle out of the fact that their alma mater kept the Kennedy scion's expulsion a secret and welcomed him back into the fold. In James Hedgeck's view, quote, having a Kennedy speak was just a way to burnish Milbrook's image. It's salesmanship. Chapter 11. Pot Bust. On August 9th, 1970, the New York Times published an op-ed piece in which it questioned the disproportionate number of young people who were being arrested in marijuana-related cases. It noted that teenagers like blacks and Puerto Ricans of any age had fewer civil rights, especially if they had shaggy long hair and dressed like hippies, and asserted that law enforcement officers were wont to roust and harass them. Written by Tom Buckley, a top New York Times man, citing, quote, some observers, the piece claimed that cops were overzealous in pursuing otherwise law-abiding pot smokers because of their dislike of the lifestyle it exemplifies, which is often associated with anti-war and civil rights protests, loud rock music, sexual freedom, and what is described as a disrespect for law and order, rather than to the seriousness of the act itself, unquote. Further, Buckley noted that there were as many as 40 million pot smokers in America at the turn of the new decade, the 70s, and that weed was probably safe because before the enactment of the 1937 federal law banning marijuana, it had been prescribed by doctors to help cure migraines, asthma, and delirium. In publishing the pro-marijuana anti-law enforcement story, the liberal New York Times clearly had an agenda and a news peg. Just days before the story ran in the Old Gray Lady, two cousins named Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Bobby Sargent Shriver III, Eunice Kennedy Shriver's son, both of them 16, had been hauled into juvenile court in the town of Barnstable on the Cape on charges of marijuana possession. Bobby's arrest, his first but not his last for drugs, came less than 2 months after he was quietly expelled from Milbrook because of his drug involvement, but that humiliation clearly hadn't given him second thoughts, nor apparently did it cause the Kennedy family, especially his mother, to get him any professional help. Perhaps, like so many of the Kennedys, he and she felt above the law. The events leading to the bust were linked to Bobby's gang, the Hyannisport Terrors, and a member of that troublemaking crew, a cab driver in his early 20s who sported a beard and went by the name of Andy Mose. A decade or so later, Shriver, recalling what happened, claimed that on July 10, 1970, Mose had asked him and Bobby for marijuana so that he and his girlfriend could get high and have sex, and offered to pay them $10 for a single joint. That's a lot for a single joint. Shriver and Bobby, although both heirs to the Kennedy fortune, jumped at the money. Ethel and her children were having dinner with the Shrivers on the Cape on August 5th, when the police showed up with warrants and told the Kennedy widow and her brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, the former U.S. ambassador to France under JFK, oops, the author made a mistake. He was actually ambassador to France under LBJ, not JFK. He headed up the Peace Corps under JFK. Anyway, sorry, I had to point that out. That's an error that the editors of the book obviously did not catch. So the police told them that Mose was actually a cop working undercover narcotics, and the boys were being charged with possession with a scheduled court hearing the next day. Furious, Bobby's mother chased Bobby out of the Shriver home, pushed him into the bushes, and yelled, "You've dragged your family's name through the mud," both cousins later claimed. At the time, Bobby's right wrist was in a cast. He had fallen and injured it a few months earlier when he tried to rescue his falcon, which had flown into a tree. On August the 6th, the arrest hit the front pages of newspapers worldwide. Robert Kennedy Jr. and cousin, Shriver's son, in marijuana case, declared the page one New York Times story in a 2-column spread. Anything the Kennedys did, especially of a scandalous nature, was media fodder. The arrest of RFK's teenage namesake involving drugs, coming so soon after the assassination, Ted Kennedy's Chappaquiddick affair and Jackie's shocking marriage to Aristotle Onassis had triggered yet another media circus. Bobby's uncle Ted had flown in from his Senate office in Washington to give his troubled nephew moral support, but he refused to comment to reporters who had met him at the airport at Warwick, Rhode Island, en route to the Kennedy compound. There was speculation at the time that the arrest of his nephews was timed to embarrass him as he prepared for re-election. Sergeant Shriver, campaigning for Democratic candidates, told reporters that Bobby, his son, quote, has never been involved in any such situation before, and we trust he never will be again. We are deeply distressed to learn that he has been charged with the possession of marijuana last month in Hyannis. If he has done anything wrong, we are sure he will make reparations in a manly and courageous manner. We love him, and for all his 16 years, he has been a joy and a pride to us. We will help him in every way to reestablish his sense of responsibility for himself and for others, his dedication to high ideals, his personal self-confidence and dignity. Young people today are being subjected to the most profound temptations and stresses. We ask for human understanding of our son's plight, and we pray that God will help him. Apparently, his famous father was unaware of the fact that Bobby Shriver had previously smoked marijuana at his fancy boarding school, Exeter, as he tried to keep up with his Kennedy cousins, Ethel's kid in particular. She issued the requisite concerned parent statement through a family spokesman, and presumably drafted by one of the family's lawyers. Quote, "This is, of course, a matter for the authorities to decide," she stated, "but Bobby is a fine boy, and we have always been proud of him. I will stand by him." She had already decided, however, that once that legal matter was resolved, she was going to kick Bobby out on his ear again. The press, which knew nothing about Bobby's recent expulsion from school because of drugs, or chose not to report it, was out in force with some 100 reporters and more than a dozen TV news crews when the grim-faced parents and the juvenile defendants, both looking suddenly clean-cut in jackets and ties and shorter hair, arrived at the Barnstable District Court, with 63-year-old juvenile court judge Henry L. Murphy presiding. When the judge asked them about the charges during the private hearing, which lasted less than half hour, they both denied they had been in possession of marijuana. Because it was Kennedy's and Shriver's first offense, Murphy placed them on a year's probation. In the op-ed piece that ran in the New York Times a few days later, under the headline, "It's the Young Who Get Busted for Using Marijuana," the writer, Tom Buckley, referring to the Kennedy-Shriver case, noted how the families followed what he called a script that had become dismally familiar. The youngster gets a haircut, changes to his only suit of square clothes, looking as frail and naive as young Shriver, for example, and he and his parents then face the television cameras to ask for understanding and to promise to try to do something about the drug menace. Back at her home in the compound, Ethel Kennedy told Bobby, "I'm throwing you out of the family." She also called for help from Dr. Robert Coles, Harvard psychiatrist and longtime friend of the Kennedy family, RFK in particular, to work with young Bobby. Coles had once traveled with RFK Sr. through poor Mississippi, and he had devoted a couple of chapters of one of his books to Bobby's father. While Bobby Jr. and Coles would eventually have a long relationship, Bobby decided to skip therapy, raided his savings account for $600, bought a used Ford Falcon, and drove across the country with two friends, one of whom had been a prep school classmate and later became a New York attorney. In Fresno, California, Bobby sold the car at a $200 loss, and just like Depression-era hobos, he and his friends snuck rides on freight trains, snacking on sausage and drinking Skid Row wine, winding up in Texas. "I thought we were going to die of thirst," he later claimed. "We were completely black by the time we got off the train because we'd been riding on the piggyback cars that were exposed to the air." On the road, having run out of money, Bobby and his chum panhandled or tried their hand at odd jobs. He later revealed that the only person he touched base with during his travels was Lem Billings. "I was riding around with bums," he boasted some years later. "It was good. I could be one of them and not be a Kennedy." During the final leg of his odyssey, he wound up in Berkeley, California, where he bought drugs with money he had panhandled. The matriarch, Rose Kennedy, considered Bobby's arrest an inconvenient family matter. According to one of her biographers, Barbara Perry, who had gone through Mrs. Kennedy's diaries and letters and quoted her as observing that marijuana was, quote, "a dreadful, dreadful curse for young people." She went on to say, quote, "I had hoped that Bobby Shriver, as one of the oldest boys amongst the Kennedy grandchildren, would assume leadership against the drug. Mrs. Kennedy had actually gone as far to send letters to Bobby Jr. and his cousins, requesting that they form a big Kennedy movement against drugs and give it enough prestige and enough excitement so that a lot of people would join that group, the anti-drug users, instead of being one of the users. But my hopes of that have been more or less dashed," wrote Mrs. Rose Kennedy. And that is the end of this episode. We made it up to chapter 11. Next week, we will do chapter 12. And wow, what a story this is. I hope you are enjoying it as much as I am. The book, once again, is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream by Jerry Oppenheimer. And once again, please do like this video, share, subscribe to my channel, click that notifications bell, and we'll see you back here next week.